The oil-stained parchment of the operations briefing carried an instruction that was, in itself, a death sentence. You are to proceed, penetrate, and return. Under no circumstances are you to engage. Your mission is photos, and photos only. You are invisible. This was the impossible order handed to every pilot tasked with flying strategic photo reconnaissance deep into enemy airspace. A mission type the men in the cockpits Riley called the funeral run. Our pilot, whose story now defines the outer limits of aerial defiance, was handed this same cold directive. His aircraft, a specialized unarmed variant of a known fighter, had its cannon ports sealed and its ammunition bays empty, replaced by bulky camera gear, film, and extra fuel tanks. The plane was a precision instrument built for speed and range, not for fighting. Its single defense was its velocity and the hope that enemy radar operators and interceptor pilots simply wouldn't see the brief flicker of its shadow high in the troposphere. The commanders reasoned that an armed reconnaissance plane was a temptation, a liability that might engage in a hopeless fight. An unarmed plane, they believed, ensured compliance. If you can't fight, you run. But on this specific morning, as he adjusted the oxygen mask over a jaw set hard with grim resignation, the pilot knew the mathematics of the mission were pure suicide. He was flying a highly sensitive, unprecedented, high-value target. The intelligence he sought concerned a new, secretive enemy weapons installation, a location so critical that the Allied High Command had sanctioned a solo flight over the most heavily defended sector of the entire front. The air beneath the clouds was a meat grinder, swarming with interceptors waiting for any deviation, any miscalculation, any engine hiccup. The order to remain invisible was a philosophical wish, not a practical directive. What the generals in their warm, distant headquarters failed to grasp was that survival deep behind the enemy line is not granted by obedience. It is stolen by violence. If the pilot was seen, and if he couldn't run, the only remaining calculus was whether his death would be fast and simple, or whether he would defy the written order, the tactical doctrine, and the certainty of physics to fight his way back into the light. This was a story destined to begin in bureaucratic silence and end in a deafening, unauthorized massacre. The line between absolute fidelity to the mission and absolute necessity for survival was about to be obliterated by cannon fire. The aircraft itself was the core paradox of the mission: fast, high-flying, but tragically vulnerable. It was an aerodynamic ghost, modified to trade all offensive and protective capability for raw velocity and operational ceiling. Imagine the specific engineering marvel of this invisible target. Its heavy armor plating stripped out to save every ounce of weight. The complex radar and fire control systems exchanged for the bulky, vibrating presence of massive, vertically mounted mapping cameras, and the very airframe polished to a mirror sheen to minimize drag. This machine was designed to cut through the sky at speeds that pushed the limits of its engines, creating a high-altitude contrail that was often the only signature of its passage. The pilot had to nurse the highly stressed, supercharged engines at the absolute edge of their performance envelope, balancing fuel consumption against the constant threat of overheating, or, worse, seizing up in the thin, cold air miles above the ground. His job required surgical precision, demanding he fly a mathematically exact route to ensure maximum photographic overlap, even as anti-aircraft flak blossomed thousands of feet below, tracking his predictable path. The intelligence he was seeking photographs of a new enemy command hub or a hidden assembly plant was deemed so vital that the risk of losing one pilot and one expensive aircraft was acceptable collateral damage. The political and strategic weight of his mission was crushing. Every click of the camera shutter represented a new piece of the strategic puzzle that could shorten the war by weeks or even months. Yet, this entire fragile apparatus, The mission, the cameras, the pilot's life was predicated on a singular, terrifying assumption that the enemy would not find him. If enemy fighters did intercept, the pilot's training was absolute. Evade and run. His plane carried no ammunition. His hands were trained to manage altitude and focus the optics, not to pull a firing trigger. His only recourse was to initiate a dizzying, high-speed dive, using the aircraft's phenomenal speed advantage in the descent to outrun the interceptors. But even this defense was a gamble. Any damage to the control surfaces or a single stray bullet into a fuel tank would turn the fragile, polished machine into a tumbling coffin. The entire enterprise rested on a thin membrane of luck and the desperate hope that the enemy was looking elsewhere, a hope that was about to be violently extinguished by the appearance of 39 more signatures on the radar screen. The long flight into the heart of the enemy's logistical network was a profound exercise in sustained, isolated terror, building tension minute by agonizing minute as the pilot flew deep behind the line. Hours passed in the silent, frigid isolation of the high-altitude cockpit. The only sounds, the rhythmic thrumming of the stressed engines and the slight metallic clicks of the cameras cycling deep within the fuselage. The psychological pressure was immense. Every time a blast of anti-aircraft flak, the ominous, localized dark puffballs of smoke appeared below him, it was a terrifying reminder that his location was known, his path was tracked, and his window for successful evasion was closing rapidly. The further he flew, the less likely he was to encounter friendly forces. His radio crackled only with static, an auditory confirmation of his profound loneliness. This operational depth was the very reason the intelligence was so valuable. It was intelligence the enemy never expected the Allies to be able to collect, but it amplified the danger 1,000-fold. The pilot had to constantly fight the instinct to turn back, to conserve fuel, to prioritize his own safety over the relentless demands of the mission commander, who was waiting for the film back on the home base. His hands, gripping the yoke, were slick with sweat, despite the near-freezing temperatures of the cockpit, and his eyes scanned the expansive dome of the sky, searching for the telltale glint of canopy reflection, the first fatal sign of interceptors rising to meet him. Every fuel tank he drained represented a commitment, a mile of return flight now relying on the plane's integrity. As he passed the final geographical waypoint, indicating he was over the target area, the relief lasted only a moment, immediately replaced by the heightened anxiety of knowing the most dangerous phase, the run for home, was about to begin. The cameras had captured their prize. The intelligence was secured. Now came the unavoidable truth. The enemy was not surprised by his return route. They were waiting. They had been tracking him for hours, allowing him to penetrate deep enough to be thoroughly compromised. A tactic known to the enemy command as deep fishing. The silence of the radio and the clarity of the radar screen below were not signs of his invisibility. They were the calculated calm before the catastrophic storm. The return journey, typically a time for the pilot to relax his rigid concentration, became instead a plunge into sudden, horrifying chaos. He was approximately 200 miles behind enemy lines, having just completed the photographic runs over the classified target when his radar warning receiver, previously silent for hours, erupted with a cacophony of shrill, insistent alarms. Not one or two, but a swarm of contacts appeared, filling the scope. Before he could even register the full scale of the threat, the first enemy fighter's sleek, predatory BF, 109 seconds, likely based at a forward interceptor strip, slashed through the thin air high above. They were positioned perfectly, having ascended invisibly from sun-drenched cloud cover, waiting for his predictable exit vector. This was no chance encounter. This was a meticulously planned ambush from above, a coordinated hunter-killer operation designed to ensure his unarmed aircraft never made it back. 30, perhaps even 40, separate aircraft swarmed around him, appearing out of nowhere like a hive of angry hornets. The sheer number of interceptors was overwhelming, an unimaginable display of localized air power. The lead enemy fighters, showing terrifying discipline, dove in precise, calculated passes, their wing-mounted cannons already spitting streams of bright orange tracers. The distinctive thud, thud, thud of hits against his unarmored airframe was immediate and deafening, vibrating through the cockpit and threatening to tear the fragile aircraft apart. Shrapnel from exploding rounds shredded external components, and the shuddering aircraft screamed in protest. Smoke began to curl from the starboard engine nacelle, a chilling confirmation that the invisible target was now profoundly, brutally visible and critically damaged. Every evasive maneuver, every desperate lurch of the stick, was met by another stream of fire, another fighter peeling off to engage. The radio, which had been silent with loneliness, now crackled with panicked, desperate warnings from his own base, too far away to help, their voices straining through static as they tracked his hopeless, solitary struggle. There was no escape in a straight line, no cloud bank to dive into, no friendly air cover for hundreds of miles. He was utterly alone, deep in enemy territory, facing an entire squadron determined to swat him from the sky. The orders were clear, drilled into his very bone: evade, retreat, do not engage. But as the relentless stream of cannon shells tore into his aircraft and the smoke thickened in the cockpit, a primal, defiant switch flipped within the pilot. Retreat was impossible. Evasion was now just delaying the inevitable. The enemy fighters were too numerous, too fast, and too well positioned. He had lost too much speed, too much altitude, and his once pristine airframe was now a riddled mess of torn metal and failing systems. This was not just about survival anymore. It was about pride, about the mission's integrity, and about refusing to be a nameless statistic. There, at 25,000 feet deep behind enemy lines, the pilot made a conscious, instantaneous decision that would forever alter the course of his life and the doctrine of aerial reconnaissance. He would defy every single order, every rule, every tactical guideline that had been given to him. He was a photo pilot, not a fighter ace. Yet in that moment, he became a one-man war machine. His aircraft, though unarmed in terms of conventional weaponry, still possessed something far more dangerous: its own mass, its speed, and the pilot's unparalleled skill honed by thousands of hours in the sky. He would use the plane as a battering ram, as a distraction, as a weapon of sheer, audacious will. The controls, once stiff with damage, suddenly responded to his desperate, powerful inputs. He threw the aircraft into violent, bone-jarring maneuvers, not to escape, but to disrupt the enemy's attack pattern, forcing them into overshoots, into dangerous, close-quarters situations they hadn't anticipated from an unarmed reconnaissance plane. His mission was no longer photos. It was vengeance. His orders were overridden by the instinct to fight, to make them pay for every bullet, every scar on his plane, every second of this desperate struggle. The fear that had gnawed at him for hours transformed into a cold, terrifying rage, a focused determination to take as many of them with him as possible, even if it meant certain death. This was defiance in the cockpit, a rebellion against the very nature of his mission. In the chaos of the aerial melee, the pilot executed a series of maneuvers that would have been reckless even for an armed fighter, fundamentally redefining what an unarmed aircraft could do. With his primary weapon, the camera now useless, and with no machine guns or cannons to retaliate, he turned his plane into a grotesque, flying weapon of last resort. His first and most audacious move was to exploit the enemy fighter's overconfidence. When a Bf-109, too eager for the kill, overshot his damaged aircraft, the pilot didn't continue his escape. Instead, he violently pulled his plane into an impossibly tight, high-G turn, bringing his wings almost perpendicular to the sky. This daring maneuver put him directly into the Bf-109's 6 o'clock, a position usually reserved for the attacker. The German pilot, shocked by the audacity of an unarmed reconnaissance plane turning aggressively into him, reacted too slowly. The American pilot then executed an incredibly dangerous unarmed strike. He closed the distance at blistering speed, and with no ammunition to fire, he used his propeller wash, the sheer force of his aircraft's disturbed air, to buffet and destabilize the Bf-109, sending it momentarily out of control. It was a bluff, a terrifying game of chicken at 20,000 feet. The German fighter, caught by surprise, veered wildly, its pilot struggling for control, temporarily breaking off its attack. This aggressive, almost suicidal close-quarters maneuvering bought him precious seconds, but it wasn't enough to simply escape. Other enemy fighters, seeing the damage inflicted on their comrade, grew increasingly frustrated and reckless. One by one, their disciplined attacks began to devolve into frantic, uncoordinated passes. The American pilot, using his superior diving speed, a remnant of his reconnaissance modifications, repeatedly baited enemy fighters into following him into high-speed descents, only to pull up at the last second, forcing them into dangerous G-forces or violent stalls. He was flying with a desperate, reckless brilliance, using every aerodynamic trick, every ounce of his plane's remaining integrity, to turn an impossible defensive into a terrifying psychological offensive. The furious, prolonged engagement was fought not just against the enemy, but against the rapidly depleting resources of the pilot himself and the structural integrity of his reconnaissance plane. The fight had devolved into a desperate, close-quarters slugfest where rules of engagement ceased to exist. In his reckless dance of death, the pilot continued to exploit the enemy's astonishment and their mounting frustration. His plane, though fundamentally unarmed, had been used as a giant, high-speed destabilizing force, utilizing wingtip vortices and sudden, brutal maneuvers to disrupt the firing solutions of the aggressive German pilots. Many of the enemy aircraft, caught in overshoots or forced into dangerous high-speed dives, crashed into the ground or collided with each other in the confusion created by the pilot's terrifying refusal to simply flee. He watched as several fighters, pushed past their structural limits by his diving trickery, broke up violently mid-air, while others, hit by friendly fire intended for him, erupted into spectacular black and orange fireballs. His own cockpit was now a scene of utter destruction. Instruments were smashed, controls were sluggish and heavy, and fuel gauges flickered ominously near empty. The pilot himself was operating purely on adrenaline and sheer will, his body aching from the sustained high-G forces he was pulling in the unarmored plane. He had flown far past his plane's operational limits, deep into the reserve fuel, knowing that if the battle didn't kill him, gravity or a simple lack of high-octane gasoline would. Yet, as the final enemy fighters, demoralized and scattered, broke off their pursuit, their massive squadron reduced to less than a third of its original strength, the pilot found himself alive, pointing the shattered remnants of his plane towards the distant, friendly lines. The astonishing fact was that he hadn't fired a single bullet, yet the sky around him had been cleared of the threat. His mission was no longer about survival. It was about landing this miracle of shredded aluminum and twisted metal before it simply disintegrated around him, carrying the impossible, deadly tally of the impossible home. The return was a masterwork of low-altitude, emergency flying, nursing the heavily damaged airframe across the front lines and skidding to a smoking, jarring halt on his home runway. The ground crews who rushed the aircraft were confronted with a sight of profound, devastating confirmation. The plane was less a functioning machine and more a collection of bullet holes held together by sheer luck. Over 100 impacts were counted, and the structure was dangerously compromised. The pilot, pulled semi-conscious from the cockpit, delivered his frantic, almost unbelievable report. He had been ambushed by a force of approximately 40 enemy fighters, and he had survived by fighting back, turning his reconnaissance aircraft into an improvised weapon. The initial reaction from high command was immediate skepticism, bordering on disciplinary action. The story was fantastical. Pilots routinely exaggerated their claims, but this was beyond belief. The flight recorder and camera evidenced the processed. Very reason for the mission became the key to unlocking the truth. While the forward-facing camera was useless, the high-altitude mapping cameras had captured, in stunning, sequential detail, the aerial battle raging thousands of feet below them. Combined with subsequent radio intercepts and confirmed enemy loss reports over the targeted sector, the evidence became irrefutable. Through meticulous cross-referencing and the analysis of enemy distress signals, intelligence officers began to piece together the staggering reality. The official confirmation of the unbelievable arrived. The pilot, in his sole unauthorized act of desperate defiance, was credited with the confirmed destruction of a colossal number of enemy aircraft, largely through forcing collisions, extreme overshoots, and catastrophic friendly fire. The initial, impossible count of 40 was refined, but the final, staggering official tally stood as a monumental record, establishing him not just as a survivor, but as a legendary, rogue ace who never fired a shot. The aftermath of that extraordinary flight fundamentally rewrote Allied doctrine, leading to the new rules of war for reconnaissance. The pilot, who risked a court-martial for violating the Do Not Engage order, was instead quietly celebrated as a hero. His impossible survival shattered the belief that an unarmed aircraft was defenseless, proving that tactical skill and aggression could overcome overwhelming material odds. Commanders realized that a fast reconnaissance plane was a deadly, unpredictable weapon. The immediate consequence was the rapid adoption of armed escort fighters for deep penetration. But the doctrine itself changed more profoundly. Reconnaissance planes were soon equipped with minimal, hidden armaments, and pilots were trained not just in evasion, but in the hero's aggressive, turning maneuvers. The fear of confrontation was replaced by a measured confidence. This rogue pilot's legacy was the establishment of a robust defensive posture for the most vulnerable missions, proving that the greatest contributions to strategy are sometimes born from the audacity to defy orders in the face of certain destruction.